Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session 11A, Hardware and Speculative Attacks. And thank you for staying here to this last session. And I know maybe some of you feel tired. I hope this session will make you more excited. So the topic of this session will be things relevant to the hardware security. And as many of you have known, hardware attacks like Spectre and Meltdown being really hot topics in recent few years. And I'm really glad to see more works in this area focusing on the hardware layer. Okay, cool. So let's get it started. The first talk will be about the speculative attacks. So the title of this talk is SPEECHMINER, a framework for investigating and measuring speculative execution vulnerabilities. So this talk will be presented by Yuan Xiao from the Ohio State Universities, and he's on the job market. And let's welcome the speaker.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for staying up so late. So my talk is about SPEECHMINER, a software framework for investigating and measuring the speculative execution vulnerabilities. The name speech vulnerabilities here might be a little bit troublesome because it's made up by my advisor. Well, I don't blame him. So it's made up of two major components. One is the Spectre type vulnerabilities, and the other is the Meltdown. So the speculative execution side channel hardware vulnerabilities typically leverage transient execution on x86 processors to leak secret data when the access should be forbidden. Typically, the speaker needs to execute some instructions speculatively, and even if the execution will be discarded later by the processor, the microarchitecture states are preserved, so the increase can still be inferred through the cache side channel by the attackers. And the core of speech vulnerabilities is a term called race condition, because there is a race between raising the exception and the attack step 2, which is transmitting the secrets. This is according to the original Meltdown paper. However, when we think more through about this, we begin to doubt it, because it's kind of still vague to us what exactly are we raising. And if we know what are the raising parties, is it possible for us to create a better race condition so that the attacker can increase the exploitation's success rate? So the first thought to answer these questions is to look into the Github of the original authors. And they do have a long list of what you can do when their code doesn't work on your computer. And you can see things like vary the loads on your computer. Sometimes it works better when the load is higher and sometimes lower. And also things like using different versions of their code. And sometimes one version works better and the other might work better on other machines. After seeing this, many people may feel like us because we think it's too ad hoc and not systematic at all. So we decide, what if we can directly peek into the microarchitectural states of the processor's hardware, which should be a black box? In order to get such detailed information from the black box, we present to you the SPEECHMINER framework. So before we go into the design, let's talk about some of the basic ideas of x86 execution engine. For instructions to be executed, it needs to go through 4 major steps. First of all, bytes need to be fetched from the memory. And if branch prediction can take effect, the prediction unit will speed up this process in this fetching phase. Next, the bytes will be separated into instructions, and the instructions will be decoded into micro-ops, and they will be stored in a structure called instruction decode Q, ID Q. And later, whenever possible, the micro operations will be issued to the ROB. And from this step on, everything can be done out of order whenever possible. And as long as the resource is available for an instruction and all previous dependencies are resolved, micro-ops can be dispatched to different ports for execution. And of course, at the end of execution, they need to retire and commit all the execution results. So our SPEECHMINER framework is made up of 4 parts. The first part takes an input of instruction sequence to be executed later. And before the execution, we need to set up the execution environment so that every time we run the same instruction sequence, we are running in a known state that can prevent lots of problems and make it more systematic. And after the execution, we will intend to leave some data in the cache through covert-channel, and then we use these caching status information to infer the processor's microarchitectural states. With our framework, actually, we can accomplish 2 tasks. The first is that we can systematically test different vulnerabilities on any given hardware. And the second is actually, beyond the automatic testing, we can get more understanding of the speech vulnerabilities, and lots of previous misunderstanding can be clarified. At the core of our framework is the instruction sequence. It's made up of 3 major components. The first is called the window in gadget. We use it to enlarge the speculative window and also to emulate the side effects of instruction issuing. And also the second part is called the speculation primitive, which is the key component here. It's 1 or 2 instructions that will cause troubles. They will raise an exception when we execute them. And we generate such a list from the Intel manual's list of causes of exceptions. Notice here that in this talk, I will only cover the Meltdown type vulnerabilities because of the time limit, but our framework can also work on the Spectre types. So if you're interested, please refer to our paper. And a third component is called a disclosure gadget. Typically, we use this to access some memory and leave traces in the cache, and use the covert-channel techniques to further analyze the data. Okay, so with the SPEECHMINER framework, we are able to test all the variants listed on the left. And we did find 4 new variants of Meltdown type, which are in the red boxes. We will not go into the details here, but a conclusion can be made is the exploitability of certain variants are all implementation specific. And in this table, all the tests are done with the secrets in level 1 cache, and the TLB entry is present. All right. So given the SPEECHMINER framework, a more interesting thing is to answer the previous 2 research questions. And to do that, we propose a novel 2-phase fault handling model. And the model is quite simple, shown in the figure. When the processor notices something wrong with the execution of a specific micro operation, the processor will immediately take some actions to prevent further propagation of the faults. This is what we call a P1, phase 1. And at P2, which is at retirement, the execution results should be committed, and all the information about the faults will be gathered together, and decisions will be made about which exception to be raised and which handler to be called later. So let's go a little deeper into the details. Let's begin with the retirement phase at the P2, because it's actually already known to all. So at the P2 phase, every following instruction after the faulty instruction will be squashed. And their execution results will be discarded, and they will never retire. If they are not yet executed, then they won't get a chance. Also, in the instruction decoding queue, it will stop issuing further instructions to the ROB because it just doesn't make sense. And everything's flushed. The information about the exception will be saved for the use of the exception handler. And finally, the front end will be redirected to the exception handler. The more interesting thing is the P1 here. Actually, the P1 is never documented anywhere in Intel or AMD's manuals. And I don't believe they will commit the existence of such phase for us. But we did prove the existence of the phase 1 by showing its effects. We have a weak assumption here, which is the processor security check will take constant time after TLB is ready, well, given the same execution environment, of course. And we do some kind of a differential analysis by changing the data's latency, and we will prove 2 points. The first point is the P1 will stop the current computation on the execution unit, which is a load for the Meltdown type vulnerabilities. And the second point, the P1 only affects the current unit, but nothing else inside the execution engine. The second point is actually a little bit complicated to explain, so we'll ignore that and only focus on the more important first point here. So imagine we force the data's fetching latency to be so slower than the P1's latency. For example, by flushing the data into memory. And if the data comes later than the P1, then whenever the processor discovers something's wrong and the data is not yet fetched, the fetching is actually stopped. And a dummy value of 0 will be returned as data for the following instructions to be executed. And in the other case, if the data comes earlier than P1, say the data is fetched from the level 1 cache, the data can be immediately used by following instructions whenever it is available. And when the processor notices something's wrong, there's already nothing for it to stop. And actually, this is the exact reason why the original Meltdown paper often captured zeros instead of the correct data in their tag. All right. So speaking of the vulnerabilities, given the two-phase fault handling models, we can answer the previous questions now. Instead of the traditionally thought one race condition in the text, there are actually 2 races corresponding to the 2 phases of exception handling of the processor. In the first race, the data fetching needs to outrun the processor's fault handling so that the data can be at least pushed to the registers. And the second race is between the covert-channel's transmission and the speculative instruction squashing. Again, we can begin with the second race, which is easier to understand. And through experiments, we found out the race 2 is actually can actually be always won by the attacker because the attacker can gain fine control over the speculative instruction squash by delaying the retirement of the speculation primitive. In this experiment, we will have a window of gadgets made up of a long list of instructions, and we will adjust the effective length of the window of gadgets by inserting a CPU ID, which is a serializing instruction in between at different locations. And then inside the disclosure gadgets, we will have a covert-channel access instruction at the end. And we intend to insert more and more add and sub instructions between the speculation primitive and the last instruction to find out the speculation window. And the window should be the maximum number of add and sub instructions inserted that still allows the last covert-channel access instruction to be executed. So showing on the right is our results. We can see clearly the speculation window will grow accordingly to the length of the window and gadget. And finally, it will reach an upper bound, which is caused by the size of ROB. Typically, this window can be so large that it's over at least 100 cycles. So it should be pretty enough for the attacker to finish the covert-channel transmission. The race condition 1 between the data fetching and processor fault handling is actually a little bit troublesome because although it cannot be well controlled, we can still measure it quantitatively in the unit of cycles. To do this, we have the idea of using another faulty instruction inside the suppressing primitive, shown in the red box here. So it will limit the total time for the speculation primitive and the disclosure gadget to execute. And by using a similar technique as the previous experiments, we can get the T-spec2 by counting the number of possible add and sub instructions. And then we can get the time of P1, latency of P1 as T-spec1 minus T-spec2 minus T-delay. And similarly, if we replace the faulty speculation primitive with the legal memory load instruction, we can measure the data fetching latency with the same method. And if we sub these two equations, the risk condition is measured as the difference between the data fetching and the latency of P1, which can be computed by simply counting the two cases add and sub instruction numbers and get the difference. And before we end, there is one more interesting thing. With the discovery of the foreshadow vulnerability, many people ask this question: why the foreshadowing requires the secret to be in L1D, while the original Meltdown doesn't have such requirements? Actually, in our experiments, we found that both cases require the secret to be in level 1D for the attack to succeed. And this seems to be contradicts such claims. And actually, this is a common misunderstanding of the public. It is never told by the original authors actually how exactly they implemented the attack against the non-level 1 secrets. And according to their presentation last year, in order to steal uncached memory, uncached data, they need a helping thread that runs on the different core, reloading the value. And so that the target data is actually in level 2 or level 3 cache. And their attack also works on uncacheable memory, but in this case, the attacker should be able to trigger a legitimate load, for example, through the syscall on the same core. So what are the facts? Again, we have some experiments here, which is pretty simple. We perform a differential analysis here, and in the first step, we will force the data in certain level of cache or just flush to memory. And then we execute the speculation primitive, which is an illegal instruction to try to access the data. And in the comparison round, we will do nothing here in this step. But in the third step, in both cases, we will reload the data and measure the access latency using a legal loading instruction. And this experiment is repeated for 1 million times, and the results are shown on the left. We can see in the upper two figures, with no speculation primitive execution, the reloading latency will be around 90 cycles. And with the help of the speculation primitive, actually the reload latency is lower to around 50. However, if the data is originally in the memory instead of in cache, such prefetching fact cannot happen at all. And the same experiment is done with the speculation primitive of the foreshadows variant. And in this case, even if the data is originally in level 2 or 3 cache, we are still unable to push it to faster cache. So the conclusions are one single round of the Meltdown US, which is the original Meltdown attack, can only fetch level 1 data. However, its illegal speculation primitive is to somehow prefetch the data from the lower cache to faster cache, so that future rounds of attacks can be facilitated. And the prefetching effect also needs some time to finish, and it seems like the memory to cache prefetching is too slow for that to finish. On the contrast, the speculation primitive of the foreshadow variant cannot prefetch at all. We suspect it is due to the terminal falsity clause, which terminates everything. And for the claims that the Meltdown can also work for non-cached data, we believe actually they are leaking through different sources of leakage, say through the LFB, like the Riddle-like attacks. And the access length for the LFB is actually even lower than the L1D. So that's so much of my presentation, and thank you all for listening.
Okay, question from the audience? No one? Okay, I will start, if no one, then I will start with one. So I think your work is really great. I mean, deepen our understanding of the Spectre and the Meltdown attack. So one question I have is, I mean, so now say we have better understanding of these issues. I mean, from the defense side, like what kind of suggestions you will give to the, architectural design, CPU designs from your perspective?
That's a good question. Thank you. Actually, the speech vulnerabilities, well, only the Meltdown type vulnerabilities are due to the wrongly implemented hardware, and while the Spectre type vulnerabilities are just designed that way, and there is no way to fix it from the hardware's perspective. And we will hear some of the solutions through the following speech from Michael. But for the Meltdown type, vulnerabilities, we believe it's hard to prevent it from the design's view. But using our tool, it's possible to verify whether the current implementation is OK or not. And since we can measure the vulnerabilities in the units of cycles, this is quite accurate, and we can have solid evidence whether a not working attack is actually due to the bad implementation of the attack or due to the strength of the hardware. Well, of course, if you found a certain variant is still working on a certain machine, then of course we need to fix it. Well, for the manufacturers, right? Thanks.
No more questions. Okay, so let's thank the speaker again.